Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Never comes again, another day like yesterday. Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.
Good morning, everybody. This is me and my bike commute kit. And I've been sick for about 10 days, so this will be an exercise in pulling my thoughts together with a bit of a soggy brain and being a bit nasally. My apologies. But I wanted to do a follow-up that I think will not be super long as I think through. Originally, the podcast was something about abusing a narcissist as narcissistic, or people who pathologize narcissists are being narcissistic, something like that. Anyway, it was maybe a more empathetic look at what narcissism is. And narcissism is interesting because it is core to all the personality disorders, with maybe the exception of bipolar 1 and schizophrenia, which are not personality, they're not characterological, but like severe mental health issues. But there is narcissism in it because, you know, when people are in that state, they're not capable of really dealing with what anybody else experiences or thinks. Like, they're overwhelmed by their own brain function. But with most, if not all, of the personality disorders, a real severe narcissism is at the core of it. And how it expresses for a borderline can be more dramatic and demanding. How it expresses for dependent personality disorder versus, you know, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, et cetera, et cetera. It presents with different colorations that therapists are trained to see and deal with. But narcissism is at the core. And so what I'm doing in this podcast episode is to add a little bit more depth to the understanding, and this also dovetails with the conversation around people who are not strictly full DSM diagnosis, toxic narcissism, but are just extremely emotionally immature, where the narcissism is more like the narcissism of a child, where it's not that they intentionally are selfish and they're not intentionally always imposing their agenda. They just haven't developed the complexity of interaction and the complexity of mind to both incorporate their own experiences at a subtle and complex level, as well as other people's experiences at a subtle and complex level. And so I'm putting a finer point, or maybe a more defined point, on that, to say that with the personality disorders, and maybe this is an expression of what narcissism really is, you can have opinions about whether someone uses it intentionally and takes pleasure in imposing their will and getting their needs met, which is the more toxic narcissism. You can have opinions about whether people really intend it or not. But another way to describe those personality disorder experiences, if you're interacting with them, is that they are a closed system. They are a closed system, and people get confused about that because it's like, okay, someone in the throes of a deep psychotic break is truly in a closed system. Like, they're not taking anything in. Their brain is generating some kind of experience, and they're completely overwhelmed with that experience. And anyone who interacts with them knows you just need to go along with whatever. And understand that they're not really taking in much data. They're not taking in much stimuli unless it's just contributes to their own internal belief system of what's happening. This is true with the personality disorders. And so what's confusing for people with narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder or whatever is that you will see people will get confused about their ability to interact with outside stimuli because they certainly react to outside stimuli, but they do not interact. with outside stimuli. Another way of saying this is they are largely incapable of collaboration. Because what collaboration is, if you really break it down, where it's not just like, oh, we're operating in tandem and having arguments over how it should be done, and maybe the other person gives in and goes, fine, do it your way. That's not collaboration. That's just someone who's willing to go, okay, whatever, you can do what you want, right? Collaboration is, I have a very soft, fairly open internal system of beliefs, thoughts, impulses, and I can minute to minute take in data from how someone else sees something, and I in fact enjoy it. And so as I'm moving forward, there's a lot of humility of, you know, my brain does this. I know myself well enough to know that my brain does this, and this has certain blind spots and biases, and there are certain strengths. And when it's a strength of mine, I might be a bit more assertive and say, hey, I really think we should do it this way. I think I'm seeing something that maybe you're not seeing. Allow me to make the argument for that. But when it's a bias and someone else is coming in and going, hey, there's something you might not see, then there will be actually a certain amount of pleasure of going, yeah, this is super cool because you have a skill and you're seeing something that I know I'm not super good at. So what you're describing is a system in which as I move forward, I'm incorporating information from the other person's system, their strengths. And as that gets incorporated, then it begins to get internalized into my system. And then I become a fuller person with greater skills. And sometimes you will incorporate the other person's ability to see, and you'll actually lose a blind spot. And so there's this great pleasure in collaboration that's not just about getting better outcomes because you're taking the strengths of both people, but it's also, evolutionarily speaking, I don't mean evolution as in biological evolution, but evolving as a conscious sentient being. It's really healthy because you evolve and refine how you interact with your environment, and you learn from people because your system is open, and second to second, you're willing to hear, experience, and incorporate other people's impulses and other people's perspectives and other people's way of approaching things. And sometimes two ways of approaching things, neither one is wrong, but they have ways in which they don't work well together. And so two people who are good at collaborating will look at one another and go, oh, we're at loggerheads here. I'm not offended by how you approach it. It seems like you're not offended by how I approach it. But when my system concretizes and your system concretizes, there's ways in which there isn't really a way to intermix these. And so we're going to have to flip a coin or make a discussion or see who got the right, like whatever, right? So those are difficult situations, but people who are really good at collaborating can do that without taking it personally. Because that's a beautiful experience too, to collaborate with someone and to go, you know what, we don't know. There's maybe an even greater context, and maybe someone else would know how to do this and the two of us don't. Right? So there's this real flexibility and openness. But with personality disorders, the fact that they're capable of working in the environment that someone else is working in and working on the same thing that someone else is working on, a lot of us just assume that that means that they have that flexibility and that openness and that humility. And it's not that they're arrogant. I mean, people with narcissism get accused of being arrogant, but it's not that they're arrogant. It is that they were hurt and poisoned so many times over and over and over and over that it sometimes, as a biological imperative, but also as a conscious decision. And I remember making this conscious decision myself at one point where I was just like, people are full of shit. My parents are full of shit. Everybody's full of shit. I am never fucking listening to anybody ever again. Everybody could just go fuck themselves. I'm going to do things the way I do it. So there was a conscious, like, there's no value in it, right? But that was because I didn't know how to differentiate between people who were kind and meant well with me and had some idea of who I was and what was good for me, between that and people who actually were malicious and shitty and wanted to impose things on me that were going to hurt me, and people who didn't mean to impose things, but they were too narcissistic to see who I was. So they were going to end up imposing things that were not healthy for me. So I'd had so many of those experiences that I consciously, at one point in my late teens, early 20s, was just like, everybody can go fuck themselves. I'm done. Like, I don't give a shit. I don't care if you're right. I don't care if I don't care. Like, I've had this experience way too many times. If 80 to 90% of your experiences of people trying to interact with you and tell you that they're going to help you or know what's good for you ends up being very toxic and very unhealthy for you, that's a rational, reasonable thing to do, right? So we don't really acknowledge that people who struggle with a certain level of narcissism or that end up being personality disorders have had that experience over and over and over until it becomes a rational, biologically healthy thing to go, never again, never, 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 never again. I am not doing it. I'm not doing it. I'm not letting down and letting someone else decide how I'm going to do something. And the problem is we all live in a common reality. So once that person makes that decision, what it means effectively is they're like, well, don't tell me what to do. I won't tell you what to do. But that's impossible because we're all operating in a reality that's a shared reality. So everything I do ends up interacting with what other people experience around me. Everything. If I do something, other people are going to, if I enact myself and take my theory of how things work and I build things, or I make music, or I write an article, or I speak on a subject, or I'm a therapist who thinks it should be done a certain way, people are experiencing that. There's no way to avoid, right? So the narcissist has this disconnect where it's like, you know what, screw you, I'm going to do my way, you go do it your way. But that just doesn't work because that is going to get imposed on other people and other people are going to experience it. But that's what they do. So where people get confused with the personality disorders is they do not take outside stimuli. They've already had so much negative outside stimuli. They're like, I have plenty, I'm done. And I used to remember feeling really frustrated with my dad. When I got a little bit older, occasionally, we had a very difficult relationship, but occasionally when nobody else was around, he would talk to me like I was a human being. He would even ask for my advice sometimes about situations where he was struggling with people and had really felt hurt by the way people behaved or felt that people didn't like him, which was true. He elicited that a lot of times because he was so abrasive. But later in life, he wasn't as abrasive, but he always really feared that people were being dishonest or were set against him. And I remember how frustrating it was where he'd say, well, I think they think blah, blah, blah. And he'd say something where it's like, well, that sounds a little bit paranoid, but it's possible. And my instinct was reality test. Like, go ask them, go say, hey, in this interaction, it kind of feels like maybe I irritated you and, now you're behaving this way with me. I don't know if that's true, and I would model that for him. And it would be really frustrating because he would go, I don't need to, I know what they think. And coming from the place that I was in, where my instinct was reality test it. Like, okay, maybe you find out they do think that, but maybe you find out that they don't think that. It was so frustrating to feel that rigid, that narcissistic, like closed, like I know what people are like, blah, blah, blah. It was so frustrating because I knew that he didn't know what all people were like. And a lot of people had been nice to him. But he was not able to incorporate that. He was not able to internalize that. So I've been in that position. I've been in that state myself, and he was in that state for most of my childhood, though I think he learned a lot and evolved later. But what you're really seeing is that's a really good example of someone in that state can react to outside stimuli, but they cannot incorporate it. There's a deep animal instinctive response to remain closed. And so it can get confusing because if you interact with their internal system, and they're an intelligent person, which my father was quite intelligent, you could hear real subtlety and philosophical perspective and possible kindness and empathy. Well, as long as you're discussing and interacting inside their closed system, and you'll think, you know what, they really, you know what, they might have had a hard life and whatever, but they really have softened up and have some subtlety and perspective, and this is somebody who has some real wisdom, and I think maybe I've been too hard on them, or I've been too critical and too judgmental. Well, now this is where people get hurt, because now you're really setting yourself up, because if you don't understand that as long as you're interacting within that person's internal closed system, they can often relate to you, and it feels like real collaboration, and it feels like they're open to what you think, as long as you're staying inside their closed system. But if something actually comes from outside their system, you will see them regress to an infantile or a juvenile, a childlike reactivity to the stimuli. Right? Where, for example, I could have that conversation with my father and it'd be like, wow, he's showing his vulnerability, that it bothers him that people may think these things, and he was not intending to be abrasive, and he's very strong, has strong opinions, so that sometimes happens or whatever, but it matters to him that he may have upset someone, etc. And you're like, okay, because you're inside his internal system discussing religion or whatever, something that he internalized deeply as a child, and he had complex philosophical reasoning and thought. So as long as you're inside that system, you're experiencing this person this way. But the second I suggested something from outside the system, why don't you risk opening your system and actually ask them how they feel and what they think and what's going on? Bam, all of a sudden there's this like, well, I know, you know what, there's no value in it, blah, blah, and all of a sudden you're like, you get this stark contrast of this mature, wise person who's lived through tons of things and has lots of complex thought, and then suddenly this sort of like 7-year-old reactivity. Like, no, I don't want to. No, I'm not doing it. And people get really surprised. Well, what you experienced was you were operating inside that person's system. And again, if this person who has a severe narcissistic wound is quite intelligent, philosophical, existential, well, you can have amazing conversations as long as you're within their system. But if you're not aware of how that works, and you're not aware that you yourself are not aware, right? You need to be aware. The second you introduce something that's a stimuli from outside their system, bam, instantly you get that weird. And I used to get so hurt and shocked of like, it just felt like a kind of betrayal, or like somebody just sucker punching you, like, you're treating me like a human being, and like you respect my opinion and my philosophical, perspective, which I may be even more philosophical than my dad was, even more into existential thought. And then suddenly out of nowhere, it's just like, screw you, you're full of crap, they're full of crap, not doing it. Right? Because I didn't understand. You can't introduce something from outside their system. You're going to get that response. So that person, those personality disorders, or the severe wounding where their biological system and their psychological system is completely shut down and become completely internal, they're not willing to allow any outside stimuli to enter unless it's very, very, very carefully curated and already connects with what their internal system already thinks or how it functions. And it doesn't have to be intellectual content, right? Very often it's just emotional content or social content of how you interact with people or whether you trust people or not. I was always sort of shocked by both of my parents, especially my dad, who is a scientist, who's very scientific. Like, he can really pull back his opinions and his emotions about things when he's engaged scientifically in dispassionate exploration of a thing. how, because they had been raised in the environment of like reefer madness, this just complete asinine portrayal of marijuana, which marijuana is not good for many people. It's probably better if you don't smoke, but it's pretty much like compared to alcohol, it's not nearly as destructive as alcohol is. But that's just a scientific fact. And so there would always be this deep disconnect of my mother and my father's like just outrage at how it was almost like dirty, filthy, druggy crap. And you're like, how are these the same people? They're not. One is someone inside their own internal system. I mean, they are, but one is inside their own internal system. But the moment you enter something in which they would have to actually allow in information that doesn't work with their system and go, well, I'm just going to play it out. I'm going to hear it out and I'm just going to see. You're going to get this reaction. So the end outcome, so that's how their internal system works. The end outcome is people get very confused by personality disorders. And the reason we get our feelings so hurt by personality disorders is because we just don't understand how their system works, right? So you could collaborate with someone who has that level of closed system. And again, if they have a pretty expansive internal system and they've on their own internalized a lot of things and there's complexity and there's some things that are interesting about their internal belief systems, as long as you're rolling along, you think you're collaborating. But what you don't know is they've never exited their system. And so you might go through 2/3 of a project and go, oh my God, this guy's great, and this is amazing, or this lady's great, like I love it, they're so collaborative, and we work well together. And then unbeknownst to you, you may introduce some suggestion or some piece of content or some way of being or some social interaction that doesn't exist in their internal system. And suddenly you will be met with coldness, behavior that makes it feel like they feel like you attacked them, right? This is very personality disorder. This is very narcissistic, where it's like, you're like, wait, you can disagree with me. You can even tell me that what I believe is offensive, but how, like, I'm just sharing with you what I think and feel. Like, why are you acting like I attacked you? I didn't attack you. I'm doing the same thing you're doing, which is running my ideas out there. And maybe you don't agree. Okay, so disagree with it. Why are you acting attacked? And so people who are not familiar with how this works, we get very shocked. It really feels like betrayal. And the reason people get so hurt by personality disorders, even therapists, can get really caught off guard where you're like, wait, I thought there was rapport. Like, how am I getting attacked suddenly, like out of left field? And sometimes if you're paying attention, you're like, oh, I pressed that button. I get it. I pressed it. I know what I did. But the real challenge is to understand that that person is not capable of collaboration, even though it may look like they collaborate. They don't. They're not receiving stimuli from outside their system. They are, what do you call it? Parallel play. Like with kids, there's a stage where kids parallel play. Like they're not really good at interacting or sharing or whatever, but in order to be with their buddy or whatever, their buddy will be like driving the dump truck and they'll sit down next to them and they'll drive their dump truck. And they'll get mad if their buddy brings sand over and dumps it in their lane, right? But they're just doing parallel play. I want to be with my buddy, but I still need control of what I'm doing and my environment, etc. So again, if it's not toxic narcissism, it's just emotional immaturity, you get that where the personality disorder can do parallel play as long as you're not introducing, and it can look like collaboration to you as long as what you're doing fits into their paradigm. The second their paradigm or their way of relating to reality gets challenged, you're going to get this very childlike, defensive response as if you did something to hurt me, like you attacked me. And that's where people get really surprised. Like, why? Like, if we disagree, fine, but why are you acting like you got attacked? I didn't attack you. I'm doing the same thing you're doing, which is thinking through stuff and suggesting possibilities, right? What happened was you brought an idea or a way of being or a social interaction that doesn't fit into their internal system. And they don't allow anything in from, they're not necessarily even conscious of it. Some of them are, they learn, they can hear enough feedback. My dad was that way. He didn't change while I interacted with him, not in my experience with him. He didn't really change significantly, but he was aware that he was stubborn and narcissistic, and he wasn't even fed. You could tell him that, and it was just like, okay, so yeah, I deal with it. So they can't collaborate. They could do parallel play. What's your responsibility? Well, you don't really have any. You didn't hurt that person. If you get shocked or hurt, like, it's understandable, right? It feels like you're just sort of like playing with someone. It's almost like going like, hey, let's arm wrestle a little bit for the fun of it. And all of a sudden the person lets go and punches you in the face. Like, it feels so startling. Like, people's response to it is like, why? Like, why did you suddenly punch me? I don't understand what I did to you. And that could be hard. You're not responsible for that, but we are responsible for understanding that there are people who have been hurt so badly for so long that that's how they function. And it isn't that you're responsible for accommodating them. You're not. If you're building a business, it probably doesn't behoove you to place a personality disorder like that. Like, they often get hired and they often work their way into management and leadership positions because their willingness to run over other people or to drive things forward in the way they think it should be done can appear like a leadership quality. They lack true leadership because they're incapable of incorporating the wisdom and the intelligence and the way of being of the people who work with them and under them, until ultimately they end up creating problems, often for the greatest talent on their teams, right? Because they feel threatened by that other talent. And so you'll see them slowly sabotage. I've had many conversations with clients of mine who were quite talented and high performers, who would go into situations and their immediate boss or some other person in the situation would slowly start attacking them and sabotaging them because they're good, they're really good, and they're not willing to just kowtow and go, I'll just do whatever you want. Well, what's happened is a personality disorder has worked its way up the ranks in that company, and nobody, even though people are like, well, they're problematic, but they get the job done, no one's really willing to recognize that it's like, no, this person is a problem. They're going to kill off all the other talent in your business. Or they're going to drive them underground to where the person is just like, just punch it in, punch it out. And just like, I'm not putting my head up. Like, I get knocked down by this jackass every time I do, and nobody does anything about it. And they're already looking. Sometimes they spend a couple years, they're just looking for that next job. And the company's like, well, I wonder why we lost them. It's like, well, you lost them because you have a personality disorder who's taking shots at them every time they put their head up. So that personality disorder is going to eliminate the talent in the business. Anybody else who introduces any way of being or any ideas that don't already fit into the personality disorder's perception of how to do things, right? So those things happen. So I sort of, like I said, I'm pretty fuzzy. I sort of lost where I was going with that. But, where it's like, what do you do? How do you interact? Well, you probably shouldn't. Like, long-term, it doesn't work. But if you're in a situation where you have a family member like this, or you're working with someone like this and you can't get away, it could be, rather than getting sucker punched and really feeling hurt, knowing that most people don't know how to deal with this type of person. Most people deal with this type of person by playing to their ego. So you can stand up to them, but everybody in that situation is going to let you stand up to them and is going to let you take the hits. And you would be shocked, or maybe you wouldn't be shocked, at how society doesn't want to deal with it. And even pretty good leaders will step back and allow the narcissist or the borderline or whomever to dominate the space because they don't really, they've allowed that person to incorporate themselves and they actually do contribute and they're smart. And as long as things fit into their paradigm, they're very good at getting stuff done. And the people at the top don't want to go through the pain of restructuring and recognizing what this person is and whatever. So they'll just let that person drive off on their talent and they'll just limp along for years, sometimes decades, or sometimes permanently. You just have this fairly dysfunctional environment as long as the narcissist keeps producing in the system. So it's not your job to accommodate, but it can be really good to know and not to get surprised by the 1-2 punch. If you have a family member like this, especially one who has targeted you and made you the whipping post, the whipping boy, you need to understand that there's no information you're going to enter in this situation. If you accept your position as the whipping boy, the narcissist will be fairly neutral or maybe even kind of kind. But if you stand up and go, no, that's not who I am, and you don't get to talk over me, well, you're just going to get attacked. And everybody else in the situation is going to step back and let it happen and go, well, that's what you get if you go up against that person. So it's really good to know that, A, don't be surprised. B, understand what made them that way and how they function. And understand that if you introduce anything that comes from outside their system, they're just going to retaliate and the intensity of it is surprising. And finally, just get away from them. Learn who those people are. They look shiny to a lot of people because, again, they're good at getting things done and they're very opinionated and they sound very confident in their opinion of how things should be and the way things are. But that's only because they've never collaborated. They've never done the difficult. They've never had to really deal with the vulnerability and the difficulty of assuming a position of humility and going, even if I really think it should be this way, I'm going to listen to other people. I'm going to allow their information to enter my system. I'm going to play it through. Sometimes I'm going to play it through when I think it's wrong just to see maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they are right. They've never done that. That's why they sound confident, because they're not willing to accept that vulnerability. Right? So society is still confused by this. They still view that as confidence. It's not confidence. It's a lack of a willingness to risk. And again, I was that person in my 20s. I was extremely confident. Like I literally felt it. I felt clean and pure inside, and I know what I think, and everybody else can go fuck themselves. And I talked that way very assertively, and people listened. But it's a false confidence, because it's a confidence that comes from the fact that you refuse to allow anything that threatens your internal system to enter the internal system. And you're not willing to true confidence comes from, oh, this is going to be uncomfortable, but I have such a stable sense of self and an understanding of how healthy it is to allow new information in, that this is good for me, even if it feels a little humiliating, or I feel a little embarrassed, or I feel like these are normal human responses. But true confidence comes when you're willing to take that position of humility and go, I'm going to allow new information in, like even when it seems directly contradictory to the way I see everything, especially when it's directly contradictory, is when you should really think it through and go, if I have a belief system that is tightly closed, that's exactly the belief system you need to look at. Because none of us have even close to a whiff of an idea of the beauty and the complexity and the entirety of what this is. Science is attempting to test it and figure it out. Theology, religion, philosophy, people in their everyday lives are trying to figure out the best way to go about this, but none of us have any idea of the totality of it. So the only really reliable truth is, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows. So if you have a closed belief system, you should be very, very careful with that belief system. If you're absolutely convinced, if you're a Republican who's absolutely convinced that the liberals are full of crap and they're trying to destroy the United States, yeah, you need to go back to the drawing board, dude. And if you're a liberal who's absolutely convinced that the Republicans are a bunch of racist assholes who just want to take women's rights away, you need to go back to the drawing board, dude, and do that. Those are closed systems that do not serve us. I'm going to close for now. I've gotten really, really clogged again. I think I mostly covered it, and I'm happy with my ability to talk through feeling really uncomfortable. And so I leave you with that. True narcissism and personality disorder level are closed systems. If you interact inside the system, they appear collaborative and they can be really wise and kind and interactive. But the moment you introduce information from outside their system, suddenly they're very reactive because they're just rejecting it. They're just like, don't bring anything in here. So don't get surprised. It's not about you. Stay away from them if you can. Know that if you're talented and smart and you bring something really different, you're going to be the number one target for them. That doesn't mean anything bad about you. That actually means that you're talented and smart and you're different and you have a different perspective. And that's a wonderful thing. So I hope that you're really able to value yourself and to have great empathy and kindness and understanding for yourself. But that also, when you understand how that person got that way, that you could step away from them soon enough that you don't end up being angry and resentful and hating them, which doesn't help you, but that you also can have an understanding and an empathy for how they got that way and why it works for them that way. All right, you guys, it's been wonderful talking to you. I love you. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Take care.
Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.